The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Courtney Forehand. I'm the Training and Marketing Specialist for the Colorado Municipal League. And we are having a webinar today hosted by our very important friend here, Karen Goldman. She is the former Deputy City Clerk of Aurora and has been offering insight and guidance to clerks all across Colorado for the past several years through the Municipal Clerk Advisor Program sponsored by CML, CIRSA, and CMCA. Karen is very active on our clerks listserv, and she is the primary author of the election book, which is hot off the presses and recently mailed to clerks in all CML member municipalities. So we're very grateful to have Karen here with us today. And in a moment, I will hand over things to her, but I just want to let everyone know that in this webinar format, you should be able to see a control panel at the top right of your screen. You will have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. All participants will be muted for the webinar, but you are encouraged to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. We'll hold all of our questions and answers for the end of the webinar, but please feel free to type the questions as you see them into that question box. Also, we will be posting this webinar to our website. We ask that you give us about 24 to 48 hours to get it posted, but it will be posted to the website. And CMCA is offering a half a credit per this webinar towards the CMC or MMC designation for member clerks who are attending. So to obtain this credit, you'll need to complete the assessment found at the CML website and submit it to cmcaclerks@gmail.com. So now I'm going to hand things over to Karen. Karen?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving and didn't overeat the way I did, and that you're all dug out from under our huge snow. I read in the paper today that we've had more snow here in Denver than they've had in the entire state of Alaska, and that you're getting ready for the holidays. So today we're going to talk about election judges and how you work with nomination petitions. And it is my understanding that the slides were sent to all of the participants earlier today as based on a request we got after the last webinar. So hopefully, technically, everything will work out, and here we go. All right, so we're going to start with election judges, and here's just some general information about your election judges. In order to be election judge, somebody must be 18 years of age and registered to vote anywhere in Colorado. And what that means is your election judges do not have to reside within your municipality. And this was changed a few years ago because there was a recognition that some of the smaller communities were having trouble finding election judges. So now they just have to be residents and registered to vote in Colorado. In terms of the number of judges, statute is very clear that for each precinct or polling location, for those of you doing a polling place election, you are going to need a minimum of 3 election judges. And it is my strong recommendation, and something I say every time I teach a class, that when you hire your election judges, please hire more than 3. And the reason for that is if something happens on election day, and one of your judges can't make it either because, they won the lottery jackpot, or there's bad weather, or, God forbid they get sick. If you don't have 3 judges, you basically cannot open your polls. So it's always a good idea to hire more than 3, train them all, and then you'll be set on election day. Now, in a mail ballot election, there is nothing in statute that talks about how many judges that you need for a mail ballot election. So we take a look at what makes sense and what is common sense, And we say, well, if you need 3 judges for a polling place election, you're going to need at least 3 judges for a mail ballot election. And then that approach is verified by the fact that you're going to need a minimum of 3 election judges for the purposes of signature verification in a mail ballot election. And in a future webinar, we're going to be talking about signature verification. And then the last point is you can appoint as many additional judges as you need to. So how many? I don't like to tell people exactly how many. A lot of it depends on your past history. Okay, so appointing people. According to statute, the governing body is responsible for appointing the election judges. And I know that in some small communities, the governing body likes to retain that responsibility. However, in statute, there is a provision that the governing body can, by adoption of a resolution, designate the appointment responsibility to the municipal clerk. And if that's something you can work out with your governing body, I would strongly suggest you do that, because you're really the ones who understand what is required and what kind of skills are needed. And by doing it yourself, it really does take away any kind of consideration of bias or prejudice on the part of people who, if you've got something contentious on the ballot, if you've appointed the judges and you do it based upon skills and ability, as opposed to a political person appointing them because they're their next door neighbor or something, it just makes it easier on everybody. The judges need to be appointed at least 15 days before the day of the election. And so 15 days is the drop dead date. It's the very last day that you need to appoint your election judges. And because in a mail ballot election, you can start processing ballots 15 days before the day of the election, I strongly urge that to the extent you can, you appoint your judges well in advance of that 15 days, especially if you're doing a mail ballot election, because that way it'll give you an opportunity to train them in the signature verification process prior to the start of being able to process those ballots. So what you do, just so you know, that the list of the judges that you're using is a public record, and it can be obtained by citizens through a core request. And then when you appoint your judges, what you do is you issue a certificate of appointment and an acceptance of appointment. So in other words, you send them out and you say, you have, I hereby appoint Karen Goldman as an election judge for the regular municipal election to be held on such and such a date, and that kind of thing. And then there is a form or a card that needs to be filled out in which I, Karen Goldman, say I accept my appointment as an election judge. And then that has to be returned to the clerk within 7 days after the certificates have been mailed out. And if you don't get a certificate, then you don't have a judge. So it's pretty important that you get those certificates back. That's your legal basis for appointing the judges. Okay, so if there is a vacancy in an appointment, you fill it in the exact same manner. This is another reason why when you appoint your judges, you want to appoint more, because you don't want to, on election day, all of a sudden having to issue a certificate of appointment and an acceptance of appointment when you're trying to get the polls open. So you'll see that I've listed as a best practice what I've already said, that you want to hire enough election judges in the event of vacancies, and I think that makes sense. Now, what do you pay them? We get that question every year on the election, during the election. What do I pay my judges? Statute's very interesting in this respect, because statute says that the compensation for your judges is not less than $5. And then it goes on to say that it's not more than the amount paid to judges working in a statewide general election. And really what the way the law reads is that the maximum is the amount as determined by law. Well, law does not determine what the maximum amount is. So I always like you to go to your county clerks as a kind of baseline, find out what they pay their election judges. And remember Now all the elections that are run by the county clerks are mail ballot in form, and so they may do a much different basis for determining the cost. They might do a daily cost as opposed to an hourly cost, whereas you might want to do an hourly cost, but at least you can use what the county clerks use as a basis for that. And the other great resource, of course, is everybody else. If you contact a community that's about your size, using about the same number of judges as the ones you're going to use, you could say, well, how do you pay them and what do you pay? And then the supply judge in a polling place election receives an additional $4. And it's a long day for your judges. Remember that. One of the things that's not on here in terms of compensation are the kind of amenities that you will give them to make them feel like they're wanted. For example, breakfast, lunch, dinner, because as you'll see, they're going to arrive really early and they're going to stay until the vote is counted. And if you're doing a hand count, especially with a large number of registered electors and ballots returned, it's going to be a long day for them. So what you want to do is definitely treat your election judges very, very well. Okay, moving on. The duties of election judges in a polling place election. First of all, they need to arrive at the polling location at 6:15 in the morning. The polls open at 7, assuming you have 3 judges there. And they will use that 45 minutes, and they can, of course, they can come earlier to set up and arrange the voting booths, the voting machines, the ballot boxes, set out all the voting materials. And then what they do is in a polling place election, they remain at the polling location at all times when voting can take place. One of the questions that I often get asked is, can you hire judges to work shifts? Statute is silent on this. From a practical perspective and an operational perspective and a security perspective, my response would be, it is not a good idea. The idea is that you don't want anybody inadvertently or unconsciously releasing information about what they've seen at the polls by being able to work, say, 7 to 12 and then going off on their merry little way. The idea is to preserve the security and the integrity of the ballot. So therefore, it is important that once a person comes in, they stay the whole day and they don't leave until the final vote has been tallied. And remember, it's an unofficial count, and the statement is posted. The other things the judges will do during the day of the election, they'll issue replacement or substitute ballots, and then once the polls close, and only when the polls close will they be able to start counting the ballots, issuing the judge's certificate of election, posting the election results. They'll clean everything up. They'll deliver all supplies back to the municipal clerk, and that would be the extra $4 from the supply judge. So these are the basic responsibilities and duties of judges in a polling place election. Now, in a mail ballot election, it's slightly different. In a mail ballot election, one of the main things that they're going to do, in addition to counting the ballots, is that they're going to be doing signature verification on the return envelope. So we'll be comparing the signatures on the return envelopes against the signatures in the Secretary of State's voter registration database. And I've made a couple of notes here that on election day, let me back up. I've always said and believed that the municipal clerk, him or herself, should not get in the weeds and do the actual procedures of opening ballots, counting ballots, reconciling ballots, that kind of thing. The primary purpose or responsibility of the municipal clerk on an election day is to be we call it the designated election official, or the person to oversee things, the person who will troubleshoot, the person who will answer any questions, resolve any issues, deal with any recalcitrant or pushy watchers, any of that kind of thing. And so we suggest that the clerk and the staff don't do signature verification or count the ballots. That's what your judges are due. But you can receive the ballots, you can issue the replacement ballots, and the voter registration issues can be resolved by the clerk and the staff because these are the overriding issues. The other thing that I want to say is that in a mail ballot election, it is not required for your judges to show up at 6:15 in the morning on election day and stay till the very end because the process is different in a polling place election from in a mail ballot election. On a mail ballot election, primarily what your judges are doing is receiving the ballots, doing the signature verification, and then once the polls close at 7 o'clock, if you are hand counting the ballots, that's when you start to do it at 7 o'clock. So if it works out that you want to bring them in at 4 o'clock on election day or 5 o'clock or even 7 o'clock, that is totally up to you. I think the idea is to consider how your ballots come in. And what we do know is once ballots are sent out, you get a good return at the very beginning. Then, and remember, you could do this, they'll come, you can send them out 15 days before the day of the election. You'll get a good return at the beginning, then it's going to slack off, and then the closer it gets to the election, the ballots, the number of ballots you receive will pick up, and it's likely that you're going to get slammed on election day because most people wait until the very last moment. So you want to bring your judges in to do all of this to accommodate the workflow as it comes in. And it's going to be different for every municipality and every election. Okay, so going back, we've already talked about this. State statute in a mail ballot election does not indicate the minimum number of elections, but again, you want to hire a minimum of 3. And the judges can serve as both signature verification and ballot counting judges. So if you only want to hire 3, have at it. Or I shouldn't say hire 3. If you want to only work 3 at a time, you can do that. And then again, as I just said, state statute doesn't indicate when election judges should begin working. And, you want to bring them in when it makes sense to bring them in. If you look at the kind of italicized last sentence in that bullet point, I always suggest that the day before the election, when it's time to go home, you have completed the verification and every other procedure that's been required for every ballot that you've received up to that point, which means that on election day, the only things you have to deal with are the ballots that come in on election day itself. That will save you a lot of time and mean that you won't have to spend the night at your municipal building in order to get everything done. All right, so that was a very quick and dirty on election judges. But if there are a lot of questions, we'll go ahead and take care of them at the very end. So I'm going to take a pause here for a moment to wet my whistle, and we'll talk about nomination petitions. Okay, whistle has been wet. All right, so let's talk about the nomination petitions. Who can run for office? People can run for office if they are 18 years of age and older, or older. They have to have been a resident of the municipality for at least 12 consecutive months immediately preceding the election. If you have wards or district, that 12 consecutive months also applies. They have to be residents of that ward or district for the 12 consecutive months preceding the election. And they cannot be a candidate for 2 offices at the same time. So let's talk about this resident. People sometimes get confused as to the requirements for registering to vote in a municipal election and being eligible to run for election. In order to register for a municipal and vote in a municipal election, you only have to be a resident of the state for 22 days before the day of the election and a resident of the municipality on the day that you register. So when you think about it, if somebody was a resident of the municipality for 12 consecutive months prior to the date of the election, but they didn't register until the 15th day before the day of the election, technically they would be eligible. Well, they have to be registered in order to run. Anyway, never mind. I confused myself here. So again, in order to register and vote, a resident of the state for 22 days and a resident of the municipality on the day you register. But to run for office, you actually have to have resided in your municipality for 12 consecutive months before the day of the election, not before the day that you run, but before the day of the election. So that means you have to have been registered for that time as well. Now let's go and talk about the statement, cannot be a candidate for two offices at the same election. There's several ways you can define candidate. There's the definition of candidate for the purposes of Fair Campaign Practices Act and reporting of campaign finance reports. There is a way you consider candidates as somebody who has turned in a petition. The petition has been verified and the person is eligible to run. Or a person can be considered a candidate if he has publicly announced or he's decided he wants to run, but he hasn't actually turned in a petition. So what this means about cannot be a candidate for two offices at the same election, it seems to me that the common definition or the common interpretation of this is that a person cannot run in the same election for the position of mayor and council or board member, circulate a petition for each of those positions at the same time, then based upon conversations he or she has with the citizens, turn in one over turning in the other, that the person has to decide. So one of the ways to keep that kind of thing from happening is that when you hand out the nomination petitions and accompanying information, that you already write in, or you have a packet that says, where you fill in the office, where it says mayor, where it says board of trustees, or where it says council. And when somebody comes in to pick up a nomination petition and the additional information, then what you say is, what office are you interested in running for? And then you give them the appropriate packet. And I think that will resolve a lot of these issues that could occur by somebody not being sure. They probably would need to be sure before they pick up the packet. Okay, the form of the nomination petition. You know, in the old days, there were companies who would provide pretty much generic nomination petitions, and I think those companies and those forms are long gone. However, Clerks exist as a great resource for that information, but I want to make sure that no matter whose nomination petition you use, whether it's one you've used in the past or one you get from somebody else, that it contains this and only this information. First of all, the name of the candidate and the office that is sought. And again, if you write it in, if you have a larger community, if you have wards or districts and they have numbers, you want to put that in as well. Then that goes at the very top. And I want to tell you that there is no warning that is required on nomination petitions. So you don't have to put there, warning, do not sign until you've read all that stuff that usually you see on initiative, referendum, or recall petition. There is no requirement to put that on a nomination petition. Then you go to the part where the people sign. And so you have a signature line, a place for the printed name, the address line that includes the street number, the street name, the city or town, and the county. And what you want to make sure is you tell people that no P.O. boxes. We need residence addresses. The date they sign. That's all on the signature pages. Then after that is an affidavit of a circulator. and the affidavit, and you go to state statute and you find the exact language that needs to be included on the affidavit of the circulator. My assumption is you've all read Article 10 of Title 31, the Municipal Election Code of 1965, or that if you haven't, you will read it. There is no substitute for reading the law, and quite honestly, if you don't read the law, you're not going to be able to run your election. After the affidavit of circulator, then there is another page where there's an affidavit of the candidate that accepts the nomination and attests or swears that they're eligible to hold the municipal office they are seeking if they are so elected. And then on that page is the name of the candidate as it should appear on the ballot. And again, the information on the affidavit of the candidate or the acceptance of nomination is also found in state statute. So it's important that you read that as well. Now, in terms of the name of the candidate as it appears on the ballot, please be aware that no titles can be used. And by titles, we mean things like doctor, PhD, CMC, MMC, any of those kinds of things like that. Those are not permitted to be placed on the ballot itself. Now, if in their campaign material they want to include that, that's another totally different thing, but they cannot put that on. That will not appear on the ballot, just their name. And if they want to be known by a nickname, and instead of being, Fred Smith, they want to be known as Buzz or Mr. Clean or something like that, that's all okay. That's just fine and well. Now, anything else that you include along with the nomination petitions should not be stapled to the petition themselves. So what kinds of things would those be? I think there should be some instructions for the circulator, and I want to remind you that anybody who can, not anybody who's a registered elector can circulate a nomination petition on behalf of a candidate. It doesn't have to be the candidate, it can be somebody else. So it would be instructions, the Fair Campaign Practices Act forms. I'm going to talk about a couple of those in just a moment. And anything else you want to include in the packet, if you want to include the Municipal League's candidate booklet, if you want to include the entire Fair Campaign Practices Act, or the Secretary of State's campaign finance manual, all that stuff, you can go ahead and do that. Just don't staple it to the nomination petition. The nomination petition should include only those things that we talked about. Now, let me talk a little bit about a couple of FCPA, Fair Campaign Practices Act forms. The people who are looking to spend money or collect money need at the very minimum to file two forms. One is a candidate affidavit form, and the other is a committee registration form. Please be aware that if people do not file that form along with their nomination petition, they're not disqualified. These forms are for campaign finance purposes only. I always think it's a good idea to include them in the packet and have them file at least a candidate affidavit, even if they don't intend initially to collect money or spend money, because you never know what's going to happen during a campaign. They might find a great benefactor who's going to decide that they're the best thing since sliced bread and they want to totally finance their campaign. It's better to have the forms completed at the front end and not be used, as opposed to have to try to chase after people at the back end once you figure out they put up signs and you have no reporting of that, to do it that way. But they have nothing to do with their if they don't file the forms, it doesn't mean they are disqualified as candidates. So I want to make that perfectly clear. I think over the years, we've sort of come to think that it's all part and parcel of the same, and it really isn't. All right, signature requirements, and I use the word minimum because that's exactly what they are. For statutory cities, who will not be having their election in April of next year, it's 25. For statutory towns who will be having their election next April, the minimum number is 10. And then for home rule municipalities, that number can vary. And it's determined by charter. Very home rule municipalities will be having their election in April of next year. This is the minimum number of signatures that are required. I always like to include in the instructions that people should think about getting more than the minimum number, because as we all know, not every signature that is turned in is going to be a valid signature. Some people think they're registered and they're not. Some people are improperly registered, and by that, it means that the information that they put on the petition doesn't match up with the information found in the Secretary of State voter registration database, in which case it's considered an invalid signature. You don't want to tell them how many signatures to get. You just want to tell them to get more than they need. Okay, let me also say, well, we'll go on. I want to also talk about qualifying or disqualifying signatures, and quite honestly, I can't remember if it's in here or not. So if it's not on the slides, we'll definitely talk about it. But let's talk about the circulation timeframes. The circulation timeframe on municipal nomination petitions, unless you are a home rule municipality, which I don't think many of you are, some of you are who are listening in today, is the same for any type of election that you hold, whether you hold a polling place election, a mail ballot election, or if your election happened to be in November, a coordinated election. It's always on you begin on the 91st day before the day of the election, and you end on the 71st day before the day of the election. And let's talk about, we talked about this last time in the calendar. When you're counting backwards to figure out what these dates are, Election day is day 0. The day before the election is day 1, which is a Monday. Sunday before the election is day 2. The Saturday before is day 3, and on and on and on. Similarly, when you're looking at doing things after the election, like how many days they have to cure their petitions or whatever, day 0, the election day is day 0, so Wednesday would be day 1, Thursday day 2, Friday day 3, and on and on. So you don't count election day. All right? And do not, I will say this again, do not hand out nomination petitions prior to the 91st day before the election. Don't do it. If you do, and this really happened, a clerk wanting to be customer friendly to one of her sitting board members gave out a petition prior to the 91st day before the day of election, admonished this person 3 times not to collect signatures before the 91st day, and when the petition was turned in, every single signature had been collected prior to the 91st day, which meant it was invalid, which meant he had to start all over again. So it's just good practice. No matter how many times you tell them that not to do it, I guarantee you somebody's going to do it, and then they're going to blame you. So just hold on to them until the 91st day, the first day it can go out. All right, this is one of the things I wanted to make sure we did talk about. So we talk about checking signatures on nomination petitions. And when we talk about it in this respect, when we say the word checking signatures, what we mean is that we are going to check that the name and the address that is on the petition matches the name and address that's in the voter registration database. And of the 2 elements, the name and the address, the more important is the address. When you talk about, we don't have a definition of registration or voter registration in Title 31, so we go back to Title I. And when you go to Title I and you talk about being a registered elector, there is a portion in Title I under the definition section that says for the purposes of signing a document, and that document must be signed by a registered elector, the signature is considered valid if the name and address match what's in the database. And if it doesn't, it's invalid. So, as I said earlier, if somebody moves and they neglect to re-register, or they're not registered at all, obviously it's an invalid signature. Let's talk a little bit about the name. Most people, when they register to vote, especially if they've registered a long time ago, can't remember necessarily whether if they're known by Ed or Ted, if they registered as Edward, if they included their middle name, or they didn't include their middle name, that kind of thing. They don't remember that. So the idea is to err on the side of the voter. And by that, I mean that if somebody is registered as Edward and they sign as Ed or Ted, both of which are very common abbreviations or shortcuts or nicknames for Edward, and that's the only person at that address, don't disqualify that signature, qualify it, because it is reasonable to assume that they are the same person. However, if there are two Edwards at the same address, and one is a junior and one is a senior, and they just signed Edward or Ted without the designation, then that kind of signature is to be disqualified because you can't tell which one is the person who actually signed. Now, you could say, well, you could go to the database under DEO access and you could look up the signature. And I say, no, if you look at the second bullet point, is that when the Secretary of State's office worked with us to get us free DEO access, staff wanted to remind all of you that state statute prohibits using the written name, that is the way the name is written, the way it was signed, as a means of qualifying or disqualifying names on a nomination petition. The only time you look at how the name is written is when you are verifying a signature on the back of a mail ballot envelope. Okay, and then I've already covered the third bullet point here. Okay. So again, you qualify nicknames if signatures of common nicknames are used, if middle initials are omitted, but it's clear that the name and address match. And also, if the city, town, and county are left blank, but the name and the address matches, and that address is within your corporate boundary, you can qualify that signature. What you can't qualify is if the date is left off. The date, that's important. So now we go down to disqualifying. And that's the first bullet. The date of signing is omitted, or it's after the date indicated on the affidavit of circulator, which is notarized, by the way. And more than one name is signed by the same person. In other words, it's really clear that when you look at the signature lines, you can visually determine that the same person signed both for him or herself and for somebody else. Usually it's a spouse. Well, I'm going to sign, and my spouse isn't here, but I'm going to sign for that person. In that case, you don't know who is the person who signed. And just like the junior-senior example that I gave previously, you don't know, because you don't know who it signed, you have to disqualify both signatures. And then there's the next one is the junior-senior. See, I get ahead of myself a lot of times, but you at least get the information. And then the same signature appears on more than one nomination petition for the same office. Now let's talk about this. You citizens may sign as many petitions as there are positions to be voted on. So obviously, when the mayor is running for office, there's only one mayor position. Therefore, a citizen may only sign one petition for mayor, regardless of the number of people who are running for mayor. Now, in the case of a board which is elected at large, that is when everybody who is a registered elector can vote on all the people whose positions are up, say it's 3 full-time positions or 2 full-time positions, or even if there's a combination of full-time and shortened positions, the number of positions that are going to be voted on equal the number of petitions that can be signed. So if there are 3 positions open, and the mayor is considered separate. If the mayor is elected from the voters, the mayor's position is considered separate. So if there are 3 board positions that are available to be voted on, then a single citizen can sign up to 3 nomination petitions. If a person signs more petitions than is permitted, the way you determine which petition is to be signature on which petition is to be disqualified is by the date of signing. So that would mean that the last date signed is the one that is disqualified. Now, what happens if the petitions are all signed on the same day? You don't know what time they've been signed, so you can't tell whose was first or whose was last. But if they all sign on the same day, statute says that all the signatures may be disqualified. So that is how that works. And so in a community where you don't have a lot of registered electors and then you need 10 signatures, it's not that difficult to figure out. But what it does mean is that you do have to keep track of, if that happens, you do have to keep track of who signed. You're going to have to go back, you're going to have to look at the petitions again to sort of figure this out. So one of the things that I would suggest you include in your instructions to the circulator is to remind people that they can only sign the same number of petitions as there are positions open and available, and then provide them with how many positions are up for re-election. All right. Okay. Non-conforming nomination petitions. Basically, these are petitions that get turned in that do not contain enough signatures. People should not turn in, or potential candidates or circulators should not turn in a nomination petition, nor should you accept a nomination petition that contains fewer than the minimum number of signatures required. So when a petition comes in, obviously the first thing you want to do is date stamp it in, count the number of signature lines to make sure that they've met the minimum threshold. If they've met the minimum threshold and then upon checking the signatures, you determine that they've fallen below the 10 signatures, they have the ability to amend their petition. What you don't want to do is give them back the petition they turned in. You want to give them a brand new blank petition. And the reason for that is that they've already, by accepting the nomination, what they've done is they've accepted the nomination of the people who signed the petition, and the circulator is swearing that the signatures on the petition were obtained in his presence. And it's been dated, so anything that comes after that cannot be qualified. So what you want to do is you want to provide the candidate with a blank petition. But if you get a petition that has the correct number of signatures, minimum signatures, but the rest of the documentation is not turned in, there's no affidavit of circulator, or they didn't fill out the acceptance of nomination, just send that particular petition back to either the circulator or the candidate, and that can be amended. Now, I want you to pay close attention to the last 2 bullets. This was something that the 2019 election book left out. The deadline for curing nomination petitions in a polling place election and in a mail ballot election are different. And this was something when we moved the mail ballot statute into Title 31 from Title I, and we were dealing with UOCAVA ballots, and we were dealing with signature discrepant mail ballots, and on and on and on. We erred in the dates, but we are aware of this, and we are attempting to fix this so that the amendment, the date for curing the petitions will be the same regardless of the election type that you hold. They'll be the same for polling place, and they'll be the same for mail ballot. And I think we tied it to the mail ballot the polling place cure date. We are looking at making that change in the 2020 legislative session. However, the change will not be made in time for your election, your petitions to be turned in. But please pay attention to these discrepancy in the date. So in a polling place election, the amendments can be made anytime prior to 63 days before the day of the election. And in a mail ballot election, no later than the close of business on the 66th day. So in the first example, it's the 64th day, because that's prior to 63 days. And in a mail ballot election, it's 66. And I apologize for the confusion, but I want to make sure that you are definitely aware of this. Okay. Quickly, people can object to the petition, and usually the objection deals with the person's not qualified to run. And here is the information, the procedures that are used to object to nomination. It's a very short time frame. Again, they want to make sure everything is taken care of prior to the 64th day, which is the deadline after which you can cancel the election. And then the last bullet, the clerk's decision regarding the form of the petition is final if they've left something out, but the substance is open to review by the district court. Okay, and I think this is the last slide. The nomination petition shall be kept for a minimum of 2 years, but may be kept longer. For those of you who have 4-year terms, you may want to keep them longer, because lots of times people who run for re-election, citizens are interested in knowing who signed a prior petition in the previous election for people who wanted to run for re-election. And nomination petitions are public records, and they are open to public inspection, and that is it. So now, in the remaining minutes, we're going to go to questions.
All right. So we do have a couple of questions, and our first one is, it's Maria.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, do you need a resolution designating the judge's appointment to the town clerk at each election year, or if you have done it, or if you have done one once already, is that good for all elections going forward?
I don't know what the one you've done before, if it was generic or if it said for all municipal elections, then you only have to do it once. That would be my suggestion, that if you're going to have your governing body designate the clerk and give that clerk the authority to choose the election judges, then I think the resolution should be broad enough to say, all municipal elections. But if you haven't done that in the past, then you could do it now. To me, it just seems like a waste of time and energy to have to do it for every single election. I think a blanket authorization is the way to go.
All right. And from Heather, we have, if someone is a county elected official, can they also run for a position on a town board?
I think this is something that I'm going to have to look up. I don't think there is any prohibition legally from doing that. However, from a practical standpoint, I would think that it's more of an ethical issue, and I think it definitely could create conflict of interest and a whole lot of problems for the person who wants to be served on both. And there may be something at the county level that prohibits serving as an elected official at another local level of government. I would definitely check with your attorney on this one.
Our next question is from Jenny, but it has multiple parts. So
Okay.
I'm going to ask you kind of one at a time.
Sure.
The first one is, does this mean they could be a resident for 12 consecutive months, but do not have to be registered to vote for those same 12 months?
Well, yeah, in order to run for office, they have to be registered. So they have to be a resident for 12 consecutive months preceding the date of the election. they have to be registered on the day. They have to be a resident of the municipality on the day they register to vote. But in order to circulate a nomination petition, they have to be registered. So they can be so I think the way it would work is they would have to be a resident in your town since early April of 2018, and they have to be registered to vote prior to circulating the petition in early January of 2020. I think that would be the way you would look at that.
So the next part of the question is, can they register just prior to running for office?
Well, yeah, that's what I said. Yeah, they can. As long as they are 18 years of age and they've lived in the state for 22 days and a resident on the day they do that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then she asks if they if you have any recommendations for verifying residency besides a lease or a deed.
I think what you have to do, you could look. Let me back up here. I've never used a lease or a deed to verify residency. In fact, I've never really verified residency because the affidavit or the acceptance of nomination says that they in accepting the nomination, they agree that they meet all qualifications to run and serve. Now, and I don't believe it's necessarily the clerk's responsibility to investigate. I think it is a responsibility if somebody were to file a complaint, and there is a complaint process regarding the nomination, in which case then you would investigate and do that kind of thing. If you know this is going to be an issue for you, again, I would contact your attorney to get an idea of the proper and appropriate process to follow in the event it happens.
Jenny is also wondering if a sworn statement would be valid.
Well, the acceptance of nomination, I think, would be a sworn statement, and that would be all that you would need. I think to require anything more, somebody could challenge that and make a legal challenge of that. The statute doesn't talk about that at all.
Alrighty, and our last question is from Tiffany, and it says, to confirm, I cannot start counting ballots in a mail ballot election until after 7 p.m. on election day. Is that correct? That
is correct, and you will actually find that in state statute. There is a provision when you look at the state statute in Title 31 regarding mail ballot elections. It talks about that the ballot process is done as the same as for paper ballots, and so when you have paper ballot, and they consider mail ballots paper ballots, which they are, in that form. And so when you look at the counting procedures for paper ballots, it actually states that ballots cannot be counted, tallied, marked who voted for, what the vote was for the individual people of the issue until the close of polls at 7 o'clock, and maybe even after that, depending upon how much, getting all the ballots ready. Now, if you're using vote counting machines, you can run those ballots through those machines prior to 7 o'clock, but you can't hit the total button that will give the printout of what the vote is cast until after 7 o'clock and all those ballots have been run through. So when we talk in statute about counting ballots up to 15 days before the day of the election, what we're really talking about is receiving them, checking them in, doing signature verification, taking them out of the envelope, putting them, and getting them ready to actually be tallied. But that cannot happen until after 7 o'clock on election day. Anything else?
That is our last question on here.
So everybody, I think, knows how to get in touch with me. If anything comes up, you can always contact me. A couple of things that I just want to remind people of based upon conversations I've had with clerks is that if you are having an election in April and you haven't had an election for quite some time, but you have all the forms and everything from previous elections, don't use what you have without verifying that they are still valid. A lot of things have changed. For example, up until a couple of years ago, we required a vacancy committee to be listed on your nomination petition, and that has gone away. Some people have put warnings on their nomination petitions in prior years, even though they didn't have to. I think while it's important to not have to reinvent the wheel, it's even more important to make sure that everything that you are doing and everything you're using comports with statute, which means, as I said, you have to go back and read the statute. To me, that's the number one resource. The election book will help you, your fellow clerks will help you, but you have to read the statutes. Most of the answers to your questions can be found there. So please go ahead and do that. We have another question?
It is not a question,
Oh.
it's a comment from Randy. And Randy says, thank you, Karen. Very informative as always. And we also have a question, or no, I'm sorry. It's a thank you so much for the slides before the session, and thank you for the class from Vincia. It does look like those are all of our questions and comments.
All right. Well, in that case, I want to thank you very much. I want to wish everybody a happy holiday, no matter what you celebrate or how you celebrate. I hope the 2019 has been a good year for you, and I really, really hope that 2020 will be a great year. And don't forget, it's a leap year. So when you're doing your calendar, make sure you include that extra day in February in your count, so that the date you're going to be circulating your petitions works out to be legal. And with that, again, thank you, and we'll see you in 2020.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Karen, for presenting today. Excuse me. I'd like to thank everyone who attended. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here today. I want to remind everyone that you will be able to find this webinar on our website by the end of the week, and we will have the PowerPoint there as well. Again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you guys in the new year.